The hidden trigger people use against you, one of the most subtle forms of control that people exercise over one another, does not involve authority, force, or persuasion. It happens through something much simpler: reaction. The moment someone discovers what can offend you, they discover where your emotional stability can be disturbed. And once that point is revealed, it becomes easier for them to influence how you feel, how you respond, and sometimes even how you behave. Most people never notice this dynamic because it happens so quickly. A remark is made, perhaps sarcastic or dismissive. A criticism appears unexpectedly. Someone questions your competence, your opinions, or your choices. The words themselves may be brief, but the reaction they trigger inside the mind can be immediate and intense. The instinctive response is to defend. The mind begins explaining itself, correcting the remark, or pushing back against the perceived insult. The emotional impulse feels justified, even necessary. After all, if someone challenges your reputation or your intelligence, reacting strongly can feel like the appropriate way to protect yourself. Yet something important happens in that moment that most people overlook. When you react emotionally, the focus of the situation quietly shifts. Instead of attention remaining on the original remark, it moves toward your reaction. The person who made the comment now sees the effect their words have produced. They see irritation, defensiveness, or anger appear almost instantly. Without realizing it, they have discovered something about you. They have discovered what disturbs your emotional balance. Human beings are constantly learning about each other through observation. Conversations are not only exchanges of words, they are also exchanges of signals. Tone of voice, facial expressions, and emotional reactions all reveal information about how someone processes the world around them. When someone reacts strongly to criticism or insult, it reveals where their sensitivities lie. This information can be used consciously or unconsciously. Sometimes people provoke reactions intentionally, simply to see what response they can trigger. Other times it happens naturally in conversation. A person may repeat a remark that caused irritation earlier because they now know it produces a noticeable reaction. Over time, this creates a pattern. The person who reacts emotionally becomes predictable. Others begin to understand exactly which words will provoke them, which subjects will disturb them, and how quickly they will respond. Once these patterns become visible, emotional influence becomes easier. The remarkable thing is that the original remark often has far less power than the reaction it creates. Words themselves are limited in their ability to affect the mind. They only gain strength when the mind accepts them as something that must be answered or defended. This acceptance happens automatically for most people. When an insult appears, the mind instinctively attaches meaning to it. It begins interpreting the comment as a threat to identity or status. That interpretation triggers emotion, and the emotion pushes the mind toward immediate response. The entire sequence unfolds so quickly that it feels unavoidable. But it is not unavoidable. The disciplined mind begins noticing the moment where interpretation happens. Instead of instantly accepting the remark as something that requires defense, awareness steps in. The mind pauses long enough to examine what was actually said, and more importantly, whether the remark truly deserves the emotional energy it is about to receive. Many comments that initially feel offensive begin to lose their force under observation. Sometimes the remark reveals more about the person who spoke it than about the person hearing it. Sometimes it reflects frustration, insecurity, or a simple attempt to provoke attention. When the mind observes these possibilities calmly, the emotional urgency begins to fade. Instead of reacting instantly, the individual becomes aware of the trigger itself. They begin to see how easily emotional balance can be disrupted when the mind treats every remark as something that must be personally defended. The quiet advantage of emotional neutrality in most social interactions: emotional reactions follow a predictable pattern. Someone makes a critical remark, another person responds defensively, and the emotional tone of the conversation begins to rise. Words become sharper, explanations become longer, and the interaction gradually turns into a contest of reactions. This process feels normal because it happens so often that people rarely question it. Yet beneath this familiar pattern lies a psychological structure that very few individuals notice. Most remarks that provoke offense are not designed to start a thoughtful discussion. They are designed to trigger a reaction. Sometimes this happens intentionally, other times it happens unconsciously. A person might make a sarcastic observation, question someone's judgment, or casually criticize their behavior. In many cases, the real objective is not to exchange ideas, but to provoke an emotional response. And for most people, that response arrives immediately. The moment the remark is heard, the mind begins constructing a defense. It analyzes the statement, interprets its meaning, and prepares a response that restores dignity or authority. This process often unfolds in seconds. The voice becomes firmer, the explanation becomes longer, and the emotional tone of the conversation begins shifting. At that point, something subtle has already happened. The conversation is no longer about the remark itself. It has become about the reaction. The person who provoked the response now controls the direction of the interaction, because they successfully move the other person's emotions. Emotional neutrality interrupts this entire pattern. When someone hears criticism or provocation and does not immediately react, the expected sequence breaks. Instead of escalating emotionally, the situation becomes momentarily uncertain. The person who expected a reaction now encounters calm observation instead. This moment of calm creates psychological distance. Distance allows the mind to examine the situation, instead of being pulled into it. Rather than responding instinctively, the individual becomes aware of the emotional pressure behind the remark. They notice tone, intent, and the circumstances surrounding the statement. Often, this awareness reveals something surprising. Many remarks that initially appear offensive lose their significance when observed calmly. They may reflect impatience, insecurity, or a momentary emotional impulse from the person speaking. When the mind does not react immediately, the emotional energy of the remark begins to weaken. This weakening occurs because emotional reactions fuel conflict. When one person reacts strongly, the other often responds in kind. The conversation escalates, each side reinforcing the emotional intensity of the other. But when one person remains neutral, the escalation loses momentum. Neutrality does not mean agreement or submission. It simply means refusing to allow emotion to dictate the response. The individual listens carefully, evaluates the situation, and decides whether the remark deserves attention at all. In many cases, silence becomes more effective than argument. In other cases, a calm and measured response replaces the instinctive defense that would normally appear. Over time, this discipline changes how others interact with the individual. People become accustomed to predictable emotional reactions. When those reactions disappear, the dynamic shifts. Provocation becomes less effective because the expected response no longer arrives. Criticism loses some of its emotional weight because it fails to produce visible disturbance. The person who practices emotional neutrality gradually becomes harder to influence emotionally. Their reactions cannot be easily predicted. Their composure remains stable even when conversations become tense. Others begin to recognize that attempts to provoke emotional responses no longer produce results. And when reactions are no longer predictable, the psychological leverage behind many confrontations quietly disappears. The discipline of internal detachment. One of the most difficult things for a person to recognize is how closely their emotional state is tied to the opinions of others. It rarely appears obvious at first. Most individuals believe they are independent thinkers, capable of forming their own judgments and making their own decisions. Yet when criticism appears, or when someone challenges their character, something immediate happens inside the mind. The instinct to defend begins. A comment may question your competence, your intelligence, or your choices. In many cases, the remark may not even be particularly severe. It could be casual, sarcastic, or delivered in passing. Yet the reaction it creates inside the mind can feel disproportionate. Thoughts begin moving quickly. The mind starts searching for arguments, explanations, and ways to correct what was said. This reaction feels natural because it has been practiced for years. Human beings are conditioned to attach their identity to how they are perceived. Reputation, approval, and social standing all become subtle extensions of the self. When those elements are challenged, the mind interprets the challenge as something personal. The reaction that follows is an attempt to restore the balance that feels threatened. But this attachment creates a vulnerability. When identity becomes tied to the opinions of others, every remark gains emotional weight. Criticism becomes difficult to hear calmly. Disagreement begins to feel like rejection. Even minor comments can disturb the internal state of the mind because they appear to challenge something deeper than the situation itself. This is where internal detachment becomes a powerful discipline. Detachment does not mean ignoring reality or pretending that opinions do not exist. Instead, it means separating your internal stability from the constantly shifting judgments of other people. It means recognizing that opinions, whether supportive or critical, are reflections of perspective rather than absolute measures of truth. When the mind begins practicing this separation, something interesting happens. Words that once carried emotional pressure begin to lose their intensity. A comment that previously would have triggered irritation may now be observed with curiosity. Instead of reacting immediately, the mind pauses and examines the statement more objectively. This pause creates distance. Distance allows the individual to hear the words without absorbing their emotional weight. Instead of interpreting every remark as a challenge to identity, the person begins evaluating the remark itself. Is it thoughtful criticism worth considering, or is it simply a passing opinion shaped by the other person's mood, beliefs, or misunderstandings? Many comments that initially appear offensive lose much of their importance when viewed through this lens. The disciplined mind begins realizing that most people speak from their own perspective, their own frustrations, and their own emotional states. Their words often reveal more about their internal world than about the person they are addressing. This realization weakens the impulse to defend. When identity becomes less dependent on external approval, the urgency to correct every remark begins to fade. Not every opinion requires an answer. Not every criticism deserves emotional energy. Some remarks are simply reflections of another person's temporary state of mind. With repeated awareness, the mind becomes less reactive. Situations that once triggered strong responses begin to feel less significant. Instead of feeling compelled to protect identity in every conversation, the individual becomes comfortable allowing remarks to pass without immediate response. This quiet discipline gradually changes the internal landscape of the mind. The person still hears what others say. They still recognize criticism and disagreement. But their internal balance is no longer tied to the need to respond emotionally to every opinion that crosses their path. The authority of an unoffendable mind. There comes a point in emotional discipline where the change becomes noticeable, not through dramatic action, but through quiet absence. Situations that once produced irritation begin to pass without leaving the same emotional mark. Words that previously triggered defensiveness now feel lighter, almost insignificant. The world around you continues behaving exactly as it always has. People still criticize, still disagree, still express careless opinions, but something inside your response to it begins to shift. At first, this shift feels subtle. You begin noticing that certain comments no longer produce the same urgency to respond. A remark that once would have triggered an immediate explanation now simply registers as information. Someone questions your judgment or makes a sarcastic observation, and instead of reacting instantly, the mind pauses. That pause creates a moment of distance between what was said and what you choose to do next. Inside that small space, awareness appears. Instead of reacting emotionally, the mind begins observing the situation more clearly. You notice the tone of the remark, the emotional state of the person speaking, and the context in which the comment was made. What once felt like a personal attack begins to look more like an expression of someone else's frustration, insecurity, or momentary irritation. This change in perception weakens the emotional impact of the remark. When the mind stops treating every comment as a challenge to identity, the urgency to defend disappears. Words still exist, but they no longer carry the same psychological weight. The emotional pressure behind them fades because the mind no longer interprets them as something that must be corrected or resisted. With time, this discipline begins influencing how others behave around you. People are accustomed to predictable emotional responses. When they criticize someone, they often expect irritation. When they make sarcastic remarks, they expect defensiveness. These reactions reinforce the social pattern of provocation and response. But when someone consistently refuses to react in the expected way, the pattern begins to collapse. The person who once expected a reaction encounters something unexpected instead, calm observation. Without emotional reinforcement, their attempt to provoke loses direction. The remark no longer carries the same influence because it fails to create the disturbance it was designed to produce. Over time, people become less certain about how to affect you emotionally because their usual triggers no longer work. This creates a form of quiet authority. Authority in this sense does not come from power, status, or force. It emerges from emotional stability. When someone remains composed in situations where others would react defensively, they appear grounded and self-controlled. Their presence introduces calm into interactions that might otherwise become tense. Others begin to sense that provoking emotional responses from this person is difficult. Because their reactions are no longer automatic, their behavior becomes less predictable. They listen carefully, speak deliberately, and respond only when a response actually serves a purpose. Conversations become calmer, conflicts become shorter, and attempts to provoke emotional reactions gradually fade. But the most important transformation happens internally. The individual begins experiencing situations with greater clarity. Instead of feeling pulled into every disagreement or criticism, the mind becomes selective about where emotional energy is invested. Many situations that once seemed important are now recognized as temporary expressions of other people's moods or perspectives. With this awareness, a realization begins to form quietly inside the mind. The greatest protection against offense is not silence, argument, or explanation. It is the ability to remain internally undisturbed by the opinions and reactions of others.